At the beginning of the 20th century, an indigenous mother from a Great Plains nation holds her child in her arms as if protecting the family's future. While the country is changing quickly around her, she keeps the customs, the way of dressing, and the way of raising little ones that she learned from her elders, even while surrounded by reservations and new laws that try to change her life. Around 1875, 4 brothers from the Kilka-Hawkt band of the Pawnee people pose side by side, still dressed like the warriors of their time. William Henry Jackson captures this scene while the government tightens control and their lives change far too quickly. The children will grow up in a different America, far from the hunts that shaped these men's youth. Around 1882, an Arapaho mother and her child pose on the Great Plains at a time when bison were disappearing and the railroad was cutting across the horizon. Edward Curtis captures their gaze, marking a way of life that was being pushed toward its end by U.S. expansion and the new frontier towns that were popping up fast, like never before. Around 1900, on the open plains of Alberta, Canada, 2 Blackfoot men face the camera calmly. They carry on their bodies and in their clothing the signs of a way of life that, just a few years later, would be pushed into the past by the arrival of cities, fences, railroads, and new government laws over their lands. In the early 1900s, 3 Chemehuevi children stand side by side in the desert between what is now Arizona and California. Children of hunters and gatherers, they learned early on that every plant, stream, and stone helped sustain the family, while the world of white settlers moved in around them, changing lands and borders at a pace they had no way to control. Around 1891, on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, the Sioux chiefs Two Strike, Crow Dog, and High Hawk were dealing with troops, missionaries, and new white laws. What they decided in their councils didn't just shape the daily life of the village, but the future of their lands and their children, while the United States grew around them with railroad tracks and towns. In 1916, on the Rosebud Reservation, Chief Black Bull was already seen as the kind of leader everyone listened to. In talks with government agents, he tried to hold on to Lakota land, faith, and traditions, watching the white world tighten the circle around his people. He feared that without these things, the young would grow up without remembering what the elders had lived through. Chief P. Pegasus led his people in the Little Bone area, part of the Saukimeh Nation near Grenfell, Saskatchewan. Around 1884, he negotiated with government agents and watched settlers' arrival change, year by year, the Cree way of life in that region, knowing that each meeting could decide whether their lands would be kept or handed over. In the early 1900s, the aging Chief Joseph, leader of the Nez Perce, had already seen war, betrayal, and the loss of his land. Even tired, he still traveled and spoke with politicians and military officers in Washington, repeating the same simple request: "Let my people come home in peace, to the same valley where their grandparents had been buried for generations." Around 1905, on the Colville Indian Reservation in Washington, an indigenous baby and a slightly older girl grow up side by side. While the government pushes assimilation policies, the family tries to keep their language, customs, and connection to the land alive, knowing that each generation could be the last to remember the stories of their ancestors. Around 1900, in the Arizona desert, A Hopi woman taught her daughter how to take care of the home, plant corn, and honor the ancestral spirits, while soldiers, railroad tracks, and new settlers began moving on to their land, slowly changing a routine that had lasted for centuries. No one there could imagine how big the changes would be in just a few decades. In 1911, among the Piagan, there was a man known as Pledger. He took on vows on behalf of the community and stood behind them in front of the group. His presence reminded the younger ones of the weight of a given word and helped the elders keep the old way of organizing the people's life alive at a time when everything was starting to change. In the 1920s, Chief Joe Lamoose was the guy everyone in the village listened to. When there was a dispute over land, food, or deals with white settlers, he sat with the elders, heard each side, and made the call, trying to hold on to his people's dignity and future in a time of heavy government pressure and almost always empty promises. In 1920 in Montana, a Cheyenne man named Stump Horn poses with the rifle he took from a soldier at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. There, an older man showed how, for many indigenous people, the Old West wasn't some distant past, but living history carried in their bodies, in the weapons they kept at home, and in the memories told at night. In 1885, in the dry lands of the White Mountain, an Apache scout named Penaltish, whom many called Sock, guided troops and travelers through valleys and canyons that few white people knew. He knew where there was water, where the enemy moved, and how much danger fit into each moment of silence. On those trails, every footprint could decide who made it back home. A young woman of the Chiricahua Apache Nation appears in ceremonial clothing made to show who she is and where she comes from. Every sash, stitch, and pendant tells a piece of her people's story, speaking of family, faith, and resistance at a time when almost everything tried to silence that voice. Yet she stands firm before us, like a quiet reminder. A young Kiowa woman adjusts her beaded fringed dress before a village ceremony. The colors and designs aren't just decoration. They mark her family and recall old hunts, wars, and alliances. As she walks in silence, she carries her people's memory on her body. Every stitched bead was taught by her grandmother, so none of that history would be lost. An Apache warrior sits with his bow and arrows resting in his hands. His clothing, hair, and ornaments tell stories of hunting, war, and the loss of land. He looks ahead as someone who carries in his memory the weight of his ancestors and the changes his people still face. He's not just an armed man, he's a reminder of how this country was taken. In Genoa, Nebraska, a Pawnee woman is photographed far from her people's ancestral land. There, at the turn of the century, she carries in her posture and clothing the signs of a way of life the U.S. government was trying to erase, reminding us that the region was once indigenous territory and that the official history barely mentions it even today. Two young women of the Apache Nation, in what is now Arizona, sit on the ground weaving baskets from dried fiber, repeating a way of working that comes from their grandparents and great-grandparents. Each turn of the strand holds a bit of their people's history in a craft that's simple but essential for storing food, water, and memory. Meanwhile, the road and the town keep moving in around them. A young Native American woman poses in traditional clothing around 1900 in an era when the government was already pushing many tribes onto distant reservations. In her calm face and steady gaze, you can feel the strength of someone trying to keep her culture alive in a country that was changing far too fast. under the pressure of expanding cities and railroads. In 1905, Chief Buckskin Charlie, a Ute leader, posed wearing a peace medal given by U.S. authorities, a reminder of decades of meetings, broken promises, and attempts to hold on to some kind of agreement while his people's land shrank year after year, and he knew that little piece of metal said a lot about the price paid by indigenous peoples. In the early 1900s in Michongnovi, Arizona, a young Hopi woman stands before Carl Wernz as he captures her image. She wears the everyday clothing of the village, but carries something bigger, the memory of a people trying to hold on to their language, faith, and traditions in the face of schools and maps from the white world that were spreading across the desert and changing everything around them. In 1899, Canson, a man of the Pueblo people, stands calmly, his traditional clothing neatly in place, his gaze steady, as if he knows that moment will become a record of a way of life in the desert before the changes brought by the government and the roads. There we see more than a face, the story of a people trying to stand strong in a country that was changing fast. Around 1890, Tsuche, known by many as Mrs. Minnie, appears in a small indigenous community in Laguna, New Mexico. She stands firm, looking straight at us, and her clothing, her posture, and the setting around her tell a piece of her people's story at the end of the Old West, making us imagine what daily life was like there at that time. In the 1910s, a Taos Pueblo family in New Mexico gathers in front of their adobe home. Their clothing and ornaments show that even as the United States was changing fast, they held on to their language, rituals, and old way of life, passed down from parents to children. There, each season brought ancient ceremonies and the curiosity of outside visitors. In 1905 in New Mexico, the young Tiwa woman, Kohit Songwi, faces the world at the turn of the century. As the territory adjusts to the arrival of railroads and settlers, she keeps the adornments and the way of dressing of her people, reminding us that U.S. history runs through native peoples and that every indigenous face holds memories erased from the books. In 1905, Navajo men on horseback ride through Tesacod Canyon in what is now Arizona. They move in a line across the dry sand, guiding their cattle, watching the horizon, and talking about soldiers and railroad tracks getting close, trying to hold on to the way of life of their parents and grandparents in a country that was changing fast. Something many of us only heard about from our grandparents. In 1915, in an arid region we now call Arizona, a Navajo woman approaches a creek carrying a simple jar. She fills the container calmly. That water will sustain the family, the livestock, and an old way of life repeated every day at the same time, learned from her mother and grandmother, while the country rushes into the modern world. In 1902, official records still show Geronimo, the aging Chiricahua Apache leader, surrounded by army men. He wasn't just a famous prisoner there. He was someone who had seen the frontier advance, the buffalo disappear, and the government divide his people's land as if it were merchandise. On that day, the country gained a symbol, and he lost the past.